Digital Gold, Bitcoin and the Inside Story of the Misfits and Millionaires Trying to Reinvent Money by Nathaniel Popper. Picture this. It's May 2010, and somewhere in Florida, a young programmer named Laszlo Hanyecz is sitting at his computer with an unusual craving. He's been completely absorbed by this strange new internet money called Bitcoin, basically just a toy for a handful of computer nerds at this point, worth essentially nothing. But Laszlo has an idea. He wants to prove that this digital currency can actually buy something real. So he types out a message on an online forum, "I'll pay 10,000 bitcoins for a couple of pizzas." Let that sink in for a second. 10,000 units of this brand new digital currency. For 2 large pizzas. For days. Crickets. I mean, why would anyone accept 10,000 worthless digital tokens? But eventually, someone in California thinks, why not? They call up a Papa John's near Laszlo's place in Florida and have 2 pizzas delivered to his door. It was just a simple transaction, nothing fancy. But it was the first time in human history that Bitcoin was used to buy something tangible in the real world. Laszlo was absolutely thrilled. He'd just made history. Now here's where it gets wild. Remember that number? 10,000 bitcoins. At its peak a few years later, that same amount would be worth over $100 million. Those became the most expensive pizzas in human history. And that incredible story? It's just one tiny piece of a much bigger puzzle. We're talking about a revolution that didn't start in the streets or in corporate boardrooms, but on obscure internet forums and in the minds of a few brilliant and often pretty strange individuals. It's the story of how an anonymous genius known only as Satoshi Nakamoto unleashed an idea so powerful it threatened to completely reinvent what money even means. Today, we're diving deep into Nathaniel Popper's fascinating book, Digital Gold. This isn't some dry technical manual about blockchain algorithms. It's the inside story of the misfits, the visionaries, the entrepreneurs, and yes, even the criminals who took a 9-page paper and turned it into a billion-dollar global phenomenon. By the end of our journey today, you'll understand the secret history of money's biggest reinvention in centuries. You'll meet the key players who risked everything. Their careers, their fortunes, sometimes even their freedom, all for a dream of a new financial world. And you'll see why this digital gold rush is about so much more than just getting rich. It's really about who gets to control the future. Every great story of invention starts with a problem that needs solving. For Bitcoin, that problem was trust. Think about the money sitting in your wallet or your bank account right now. Why is it worth anything at all? It's worth something. Because we trust the government that prints it. We trust the banks that hold it. We trust that when we hand over a $20 bill, the person receiving it will accept it, because they trust it too. Money, when you really think about it, is a shared story, a collective belief system. But what happens when that trust completely breaks down? In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, a small but incredibly smart group of programmers and thinkers, they called themselves the cypherpunks, began worrying about exactly this question. They watched as the world became more digital. Our lives, our conversations, our money, everything was moving online. And in this new digital world, they saw governments and giant corporations gaining more and more control. They could watch what we did, read what we wrote, and most importantly, control how we spent our money. Think about it. A transaction with your credit card isn't private at all. The bank knows. The credit card company knows. The government can know if it wants to. The cypherpunks dreamed of creating a digital version of cash, something you could spend online with the same privacy and freedom as handing a dollar bill to a friend on the street. One of the earliest pioneers in this quest was a guy named Hal Finney. Hal wasn't your stereotypical computer nerd hunched over a keyboard in a dark basement. He was athletic, the kind of guy who read calculus books for fun and was fascinated by wild science fiction ideas like cryogenically freezing humans to bring them back to life in the future. He was also deeply passionate about privacy. He became one of the first employees at a company called Pretty Good Privacy, which created software that let people send encrypted messages that no government could intercept and read. For years, Hal and his fellow cypherpunks experimented with creating electronic cash, but they kept hitting the same frustrating wall. If you have a digital file that represents $1, what's stopping someone from just copying and pasting it 1,000,000 times? This became known as the, quote, double spending problem. To solve it, you needed some central authority, like a bank, to keep a ledger of all transactions and make sure nobody cheated. But that brought them right back to square one. They didn't want to have to trust a bank. They were completely stuck. The dream of a truly decentralized, trustless digital cash seemed like pure fantasy. And then everything changed. On Halloween of 2008, right as the world was reeling from a massive financial crisis that shattered people's trust in banks and governments, a mysterious paper appeared on a cryptography email list. It was 9 pages long with the title, Bitcoin, a peer-to-peer electronic cash system. The author's name? Satoshi Nakamoto. Nobody had ever heard of this person. No background, no credentials, no university affiliation. Just the idea. And honestly, the idea was absolutely breathtaking. Satoshi Nakamoto claimed to have solved the double spending problem. He'd figured out a way to create a digital cash system that didn't need a bank or any central authority whatsoever. The system would be run by the people who used it, a true network of peers. The key to his invention was something revolutionary that would eventually be known as the blockchain. Imagine a giant public digital ledger, like a shared notebook, that everyone in the world can see, but no single person can change or erase. Every time someone sends a Bitcoin, that transaction gets announced to the entire network. Then, volunteers called miners bundle these transactions together into what's called a block. Here's where it gets genius. To add their block to the chain, these miners have to solve an incredibly difficult mathematical puzzle. It's like a giant lottery, where thousands of computers are all guessing numbers as fast as they possibly can. The first miner to crack the puzzle gets to add their block of transactions to the chain, and as a reward, they receive a batch of brand new Bitcoins. This whole process is called mining, because it's essentially like digitally mining for gold. Once a block gets added, it's permanently linked to the one before it, creating a chain of blocks, the blockchain. This chain becomes the single source of truth for every transaction that has ever happened. Because it's shared and verified by thousands of computers around the world, it's virtually impossible to cheat the system. To change a past transaction, you'd have to go back and resolve the puzzles for every single block that came after it, all while the rest of the network keeps moving forward. It's basically a computational impossibility. Satoshi had actually done it. He'd created a system where trust wasn't needed in people or institutions. The trust was built right into the code itself, into the unchangeable mathematics of the blockchain. Hal Finney read Satoshi's paper and felt electrified. This was the idea he and the cypherpunks had been dreaming about for decades. He immediately started emailing back and forth with Satoshi, helping debug the software. On January 10, 2009, Hal Finney became one of the very first people besides Satoshi to actually run the Bitcoin software. A few days later, he received the first Bitcoin transaction ever sent, 10 Bitcoins from Satoshi Nakamoto himself, just to test whether it actually worked. The system was alive and running. But in those early days, it was an incredibly lonely world. For months, the only people on the network were essentially Satoshi and Hal. Bitcoins were completely worthless, just a curiosity, a neat experiment. Hal's computer processor whirred loudly as it mined coins, and his son complained about the wear and tear on the machine. Eventually, Hal even turned off the mining function. The great experiment seemed destined to be nothing more than an interesting footnote. But a new kind of believer was about to show up. Far away in Helsinki, Finland, a shy, lanky computer science student named Martti Malmi stumbled across Bitcoin in the spring of 2009. Martti wasn't a cryptography veteran like Hal. He was a young idealist, fascinated by anarchist philosophy and the power of technology to challenge government control. When he read about Bitcoin, he immediately saw its political potential. Here was a currency that no central bank could manipulate or devalue at will. Satoshi had designed Bitcoin to be scarce, just like gold. There would only ever be 21 million Bitcoins created, and their release followed a slow, predictable schedule. This was a direct challenge to governments that could print money endlessly, funding wars, and devaluing the savings of ordinary citizens. Marty sent Satoshi an email, offering to help in any way he could. Satoshi, who admitted he was a much better coder than writer, was thrilled to have an enthusiastic volunteer. He essentially gave Marty the keys to the Bitcoin website, bitcoin.org, and Marty completely revamped it, writing simple, accessible explanations for beginners. He framed Bitcoin not just as a cool technical innovation, but as a genuine tool for freedom. Be safe from the unfair monetary policies of monopolistic central banks, the revamped website boldly declared. Marty became Satoshi's first and most important lieutenant. He taught himself the programming language Satoshi used and became the main person making improvements to the core Bitcoin software. He kept his computer running day and night, helping secure the network and, in the process, mining thousands of Bitcoins on his laptop. Still, by the end of 2009, Bitcoin was basically a ghost town. Almost nobody was actually using it to send or receive money for real purposes. "We need an application to bootstrap it," Satoshi wrote to Marty. "Any ideas?" The idea that would provide Bitcoin its first real use case wasn't exactly what its idealistic creators had hoped for, but it definitely proved the technology worked. Back in Florida, that programmer Laszlo Hanyecz, the guy who would later buy those famous pizzas, made an important breakthrough. He figured out that he could use the powerful graphics processing unit in his computer, originally designed for gaming, to mine Bitcoins hundreds of times faster than a standard computer's processor. Suddenly, he was winning 1 or 2 blocks every hour, earning hundreds of new Bitcoins daily. Satoshi felt torn about this. On one hand, more computing power made the network more secure. On the other hand, if one person was getting all the new coins, it would discourage new people from joining in. "I don't mean to sound like a socialist," Satoshi wrote to Laszlo, gently asking him to ease up a bit. But Laszlo wasn't just hoarding his coins in some digital vault. He genuinely wanted to prove they could be used for something real. And that's what led to his historic forum post in May 2010, offering 10,000 Bitcoins for 2 pizzas. That simple transaction was a genuine milestone. It demonstrated that Bitcoin wasn't just a theoretical idea floating around in cyberspace. It could actually be a medium of exchange. The news, though small at the time, was a crucial spark. That spark got fanned into a real flame by a website called Slashdot, a popular news aggregator for tech enthusiasts. In July 2010, they ran a small post about the new version of the Bitcoin software. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The number of people downloading the software absolutely skyrocketed. The tiny, quiet community was suddenly flooded with new, curious users. But there was an obvious problem. If you were one of these new users, how exactly did you get Bitcoins? Mining was becoming harder and harder as more people joined the network. And there were only a few primitive, unreliable websites where you could actually buy them. This frustration was deeply felt by a man named Jed McCaleb. Jed was a brilliant, introverted programmer from Arkansas who had already made a small fortune creating eDonkey, one of the successors to the music-sharing site Napster. He was living in a sprawling, mostly empty house north of New York City when he read that Slashdot article. Intrigued, he tried to buy some Bitcoins late one night, but found all the existing exchanges were either offline or incredibly clunky to use. "This is so lame," he complained to his partner. "I can't even buy any at night." So Jed did what brilliant programmers naturally do when they encounter a problem. He decided to build a better solution himself. In a single night of coding, he created a new Bitcoin exchange. For the name, he used an old, unused domain he owned from a previous project, mtgox.com. It stood for Magic, the Gathering Online Exchange, a site he'd once built for trading cards from the popular fantasy game. The name was admittedly weird and nerdy, but it would soon become the absolute center of the Bitcoin universe. Mt. Gox was a genuine game-changer. It was automated, always online, and it allowed users to deposit money through PayPal, making it far easier to buy and sell Bitcoins than ever before. Within just a month of launching in July 2010, Mt. Gox had become the largest Bitcoin business in the world. The existence of a liquid, functioning exchange had a profound effect on Bitcoin. For the first time, it had a real-time, fluctuating price. It went from being just a curiosity to an actual tradable asset. And as more people bought in, the price started climbing. From fractions of a penny, it rose to 5 cents, then 10, then 30. This rise in value brought Bitcoin to the attention of a completely new kind of user, one that would give the currency its first real killer app, and also its first major scandal. In early 2011, a post appeared on the Bitcoin forums under the username Altoid. "Has anyone seen Silk Road yet?" it asked innocently. It's kind of like an anonymous version of Amazon. The person behind Altoid was a 26-year-old Texan named Ross Ulbricht. Ross was handsome, well-educated, a former Eagle Scout who had become a passionate libertarian, deeply believing that government was the ultimate barrier to human freedom. He wanted to create what he called an economic simulation, to give people a first-hand experience of what it would be like to live in a world without the systemic use of force. His simulation was Silk Road, an online marketplace where people could buy and sell anything, completely anonymously, and by anything, he mostly meant illegal drugs. To build his anonymous marketplace, Ross combined two powerful technologies. The first was Tor, software that allows users to browse the web without revealing their location or identity. The second, and absolutely key to the whole thing, was Bitcoin. Buyers could pay for drugs on Silk Road using Bitcoin, and while the transaction would be recorded on the public blockchain, it wouldn't reveal the actual names of the people involved. Silk Road was a revelation for Bitcoin. Suddenly it had a purpose that went far beyond nerdy experiments and philosophical discussions. It became the only practical way to conduct business on this new, anonymous digital frontier. As news of Silk Road spread, first through hacker communities and then through a sensational article on the website Gawker, thousands of new users flocked to Bitcoin, not because they were libertarians or cryptography enthusiasts, but simply because they needed it to buy things they couldn't buy anywhere else. The effect on Bitcoin's price was absolutely explosive. In the spring of 2011, the value of a single Bitcoin shot up from under $1 all the way to over $30. The first major Bitcoin bubble was officially on. People who had been casually mining coins on their laptops for fun suddenly found themselves sitting on small fortunes. This sudden wave of attention and money brought new faces and fresh energy into the community. One of the most important was Gavin Andresen, a soft-spoken programmer from Massachusetts who would become one of Bitcoin's most pivotal figures. Gavin was drawn to Bitcoin's elegant, decentralized design. Unlike many of the early adopters, he wasn't a political radical. He was pragmatic and level-headed, a family man who actually served on his local town committee. As Satoshi Nakamoto began to gradually fade away from the project, he saw in Gavin a trustworthy successor. In late 2010, Satoshi handed over the keys to the kingdom to Gavin, making him the lead developer responsible for maintaining and updating the core Bitcoin software. It was a crucial transition point. The project was shifting from its mysterious, anonymous creator to a public, accountable leader. In April 2011, Satoshi Nakamoto sent his final email. "I've moved on to other things," he wrote simply to a developer. "It's in good hands with Gavin and everyone." Then he vanished, never to be heard from again. The disappearance of its creator only added to Bitcoin's growing mystique, but a new era was definitely dawning, and it would be defined by the entrepreneurs trying to build real, sustainable businesses on top of this radical technology. The first bubble, however, was about to pop in truly spectacular fashion. The explosive growth of 2011 had put immense strain on the fragile infrastructure of the Bitcoin world, and nowhere was that strain more obvious than at Mt. Gox. The exchange, still being run by Jed McCaleb, was really struggling to handle the volume and was plagued by ongoing security issues. Tired of the constant headaches, Jed sold the company to a quirky, overweight French programmer living in Tokyo named Marc Karpelès. Marc was undeniably a brilliant coder, but he turned out to be a terrible manager. He kept obsessive control over every single aspect of the exchange, trusting no one and delegating nothing. In June 2011, a hacker broke into Mt. Gox, stole the entire user database, and used a compromised account to artificially crash the price of Bitcoin from $17 to literally 1 penny in just a matter of minutes. It was an absolute catastrophe. The price eventually recovered, but trust was fundamentally shattered. This was the first major test of Bitcoin's resilience, and it was followed by a long, brutal period that people now call the, quote, crypto winter. The price crashed from its high of over $30 and would languish in the single digits for more than a year. Media outlets everywhere declared Bitcoin officially dead, but a core group of true believers never lost faith. Among them was Roger Ver, a charismatic and incredibly energetic American entrepreneur living in Tokyo. Roger had been an early libertarian activist who had even served time in prison for selling a product on eBay that the government deemed an explosive. He discovered Bitcoin right after the Mt. Gox crash and had what he described as an almost religious conversion experience. He saw it as potentially the most important invention since the Internet itself, a tool that could finally free humanity from the control of governments. Roger became Bitcoin's most passionate evangelist, earning himself the nickname Bitcoin Jesus. He used his personal fortune to invest in nearly every promising Bitcoin startup he could find. He put up billboards in Silicon Valley and turned his company's radio ads into full-blown commercials for Bitcoin. While everyone else was panic selling, Roger was buying up tens of thousands of coins, almost single-handedly keeping the price from collapsing to zero. One of the companies Roger invested in was a scrappy New York startup called BitInstant, founded by a cherubic, fast-talking 22-year-old from Brooklyn named Charlie Shrem. Charlie wasn't really an ideologue like Roger. He was more of a natural-born hustler who saw a genuine business opportunity. BitInstant made it incredibly easy for regular people to buy Bitcoins, partnering with stores like Walmart and Duane Reade to allow simple cash deposits. Working alongside Charlie was Eric Voorhees, a sharp, idealistic libertarian from Colorado who had joined something called the Free State Project in New Hampshire, a movement attempting to create an actual libertarian society. Together, Charlie, Eric, and Roger formed a powerful trio, spreading the gospel of Bitcoin far and wide during the lean, difficult years of 2011 and 2012. And then, just as the old guard was consolidating its power and influence, the new money arrived. In the summer of 2012, on the Spanish party island of Ibiza, two very tall, very famous twins were approached at a beach club. They were Cameron and Tyler Winklevoss, best known for their lengthy legal battle with Mark Zuckerberg over the creation of Facebook. An investor in BitInstant named David Azar pitched them hard on Bitcoin. The twins were definitely intrigued. They'd received a $65 million settlement from the Facebook lawsuit and were actively looking for the next big thing to invest in. When they got back to the States, they dove deep into research. What they discovered was a technology with the potential to be just as disruptive as the social network they felt they'd been unfairly cut out of. They met with Charlie and Eric and were immediately captivated by the possibilities. They decided not only to invest heavily in BitInstant, but to start aggressively buying up Bitcoins themselves, and we're talking a lot of them. Their stated goal was to own a full 1% of all Bitcoins in existence. With their fame and fortune, the Winklevoss twins brought a completely new level of legitimacy and mainstream media attention to the space. Bitcoin was no longer just for geeks and drug dealers. It was now attracting the attention of serious, powerful, connected investors. But perhaps the single most influential new convert was a man from literally a world away. Wences Casares was a legendary entrepreneur from Argentina. He'd grown up in Patagonia on a sheep ranch, and had lived through multiple episodes of devastating hyperinflation, where his family's life savings were completely wiped out overnight. He understood, in a way most people in the developed world simply couldn't, just how fragile traditional money could actually be. When a friend told him about Bitcoin in late 2011, he was initially quite skeptical, but the more he studied it, the more he recognized its enormous potential. He saw it not as a replacement for the dollar in everyday transactions, but as a replacement for gold, a truly global, completely apolitical store of value that no government could control, manipulate, or arbitrarily devalue. For people in countries like Argentina with unstable currencies, it represented a potential lifeline. Wences quietly began buying up millions of dollars worth of bitcoins. He was already a highly respected figure in Silicon Valley, and he started using his considerable influence to spread the word among the most powerful people in both technology and finance. He gave a captivating presentation at an exclusive, invite-only conference hosted by the investment bank Allen & Company. At one memorable dinner, he passed his phone around the table, instantly sending $250,000 in Bitcoin from phone to phone, for essentially free, to the absolute amazement of tech billionaires and Wall Street titans sitting there. The message was definitely spreading through the right circles. People like Mark Andreessen, the creator of the first widely used web browser, and Reid Hoffman, the founder of LinkedIn, began making serious investments. Their venture capital firm, Andreessen Horowitz, would eventually invest tens of millions of dollars into Bitcoin companies like Coinbase, a user-friendly exchange that aimed to be the Gmail of Bitcoin, simple enough for your grandmother to use. This major influx of smart money from Silicon Valley triggered the second great Bitcoin bubble. Throughout 2013, the price went on an absolutely meteoric rise. It started the year at just $13. By April, it had shot up to a staggering $260, before crashing back down to around $100. But unlike the first crash, this correction was relatively short-lived. The news driving this frenzy was coming from all corners of the globe. In China, a charismatic entrepreneur named Bobby Lee took over the country's first Bitcoin exchange, BTC China, and made it incredibly easy for Chinese citizens to buy in. China, with its long history of strict capital controls and a deeply ingrained culture of speculation, went into full-blown Bitcoin mania. For a while, Chinese exchanges were essentially driving the entire global price, which surged past $1,000 for the first time in November 2013. Back in the United States, a Senate hearing on Bitcoin in Washington produced surprisingly positive, even encouraging statements from government regulators, who called the technology a legitimate, quote, financial innovation. The market interpreted this as essentially a green light from the authorities, and the price soared even higher in response. At the absolute peak of this frenzy, all the Bitcoins in the entire world were collectively worth over $10 billion. The early adopters, people like Roger Ver, the Winklevoss twins, and Wences Casares, were now sitting on personal fortunes worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Marty Malmi, that Finnish student who'd helped Satoshi in the early days, sold some of his coins and bought himself a nice apartment in Helsinki. Even Hal Finney, now tragically paralyzed by Lou Gehrig's disease and unable to move anything but his eyes, was able to sell some of his original Bitcoins to help pay for his extensive medical care. But the exact same forces that had propelled Bitcoin to these incredible heights were also beginning to expose its deepest, most fundamental weaknesses. The story was rapidly moving from creation to collision. The fall of 2013 and the beginning of 2014 would prove to be a genuine time of reckoning. First, the original sin of Bitcoin, its association with illegal activity, came back to haunt it in a very public way. In October 2013, the FBI dramatically shut down Silk Road and arrested Ross Ulbricht in a San Francisco library, with agents grabbing his laptop before he could encrypt it. The takedown of the world's largest online drug marketplace was seen by many in the Bitcoin community as actually a cleansing moment, a chance to finally shed the currency's dark associations with crime. The price dipped briefly on the news but quickly recovered, seemingly proving that the Bitcoin economy was now much larger and more diverse than any single website. But the much bigger crises were internal ones. BitInstant, Charlie Shrem's once promising company, collapsed under the crushing weight of regulatory pressure and bitter internal conflicts with its investors, the Winklevoss twins. In January 2014, Charlie Shrem was arrested at JFK Airport and charged with money laundering for allegedly helping to sell bitcoins to users of Silk Road. The brash young face of Bitcoin in New York was now facing serious prison time. Then came the final, absolutely devastating blow to confidence. Mt. Gox, the exchange that had once been the beating heart of the entire Bitcoin world, had actually been slowly imploding for months behind the scenes. Run with truly baffling incompetence by Mark Karpelès, the exchange had been steadily losing Bitcoins to hackers for literally years. A slow, silent bleed that Mark either genuinely didn't notice or simply couldn't figure out how to stop. In February 2014, the dam finally broke completely. The exchange abruptly shut down all customer withdrawals without explanation. Then the entire website went completely dark. A leaked internal document revealed the horrifying truth. Nearly 850,000 bitcoins belonging to both the company and its customers were simply gone, vanished. At the time, they were worth nearly $500 million. It was one of the largest financial heists in modern history, and it had happened in the completely unregulated Wild West of the Bitcoin world. The collapse of Mt. Gox was genuinely cataclysmic for Bitcoin's reputation. The price crashed by more than 50% almost immediately, and the chorus of voices declaring Bitcoin definitively dead was louder and more confident than ever before. It seemed like the grand experiment had finally, conclusively failed. And yet somehow, it didn't actually die. What happened next was perhaps the most telling and important part of the entire story. The price eventually stabilized. The network just kept running, block after block, like nothing had happened. The remaining companies, the more professional, better-funded ones like Coinbase and Bitstamp, quickly banded together and issued a strong joint statement, declaring that the failure was Mt. Gox's institutional failure, not Bitcoin's fundamental failure. The fall of Mt. Gox, much like the earlier fall of Silk Road, came to be seen as a painful but actually necessary step in Bitcoin's maturation process. It cleared out the irresponsible, amateurish early players and made room for a new, more professional phase, one focused less on anonymous currency for buying drugs and more on the genuinely revolutionary technology of the blockchain itself. Even the big banks on Wall Street, which had previously scoffed at Bitcoin and dismissed it as a joke, began taking it seriously. They weren't particularly interested in the currency aspect, but they became absolutely fascinated by the blockchain technology. They recognized the potential for a shared, decentralized, tamper-proof ledger to completely transform the creaky, inefficient, expensive plumbing of the global financial system. Major companies like J.P. Morgan and Wells Fargo quietly started their own internal working groups to study exactly how they could harness and use this technology for their own purposes. Meanwhile, in Silicon Valley, the big visionaries were thinking even bigger and bolder. They saw the blockchain as potentially a whole new fundamental layer of the Internet itself, what they started calling an Internet of Value. They imagined an ambitious future, where not just money, but also stocks, property titles, legal contracts, medical records, and even votes in elections could be stored and transferred on various blockchains, all done securely and without expensive middlemen taking their cut. The story of digital gold doesn't really have a neat, tidy ending. Because honestly, the story is still very much being written today. It's a story that began with just a handful of cypherpunks dreaming of a better, freer world. It was born in the elegant code of an anonymous genius. It was carefully nurtured by a small group of true believers, And it was ultimately hijacked, for better or worse, by speculators, idealists, criminals, and entrepreneurs, all pursuing their own visions. It's a story absolutely filled with incredible fortunes, made and lost, of inspiring visionary ideals clashing with all too human failings and weaknesses. It shows us pretty clearly that technology, no matter how mathematically brilliant or elegantly designed, is ultimately only as good as the people who choose to use it. The underlying code for Bitcoin might have been essentially perfect, but the messy ecosystem built on top of it turned out to be a chaotic, often dangerous reflection of our own deeply flawed world. But through absolutely all of it, the scandals, the crashes, the arrests, the exchange collapses, the network itself survived. The blockchain just kept steadily growing, block by block, every 10 minutes like clockwork, a quiet but persistent heartbeat in the background of all the human chaos and drama. The powerful idea that Satoshi Nakamoto unleashed upon the world proved to be far more resilient and robust than any single company, exchange, or individual personality. It had genuinely become something much bigger than even its creators ever imagined possible. When you step back from the absolute whirlwind of stories and personalities in digital gold, what's the real big lesson here? What's the one thing that truly matters and will stick with you? For me, it comes down to one simple but profound idea. Money is fundamentally a story. For literally thousands of years, that story has been written and tightly controlled by kings, governments, and banks. They're the ones who told us what had value, how we could use it, and what all the rules were. And for the most part, throughout history, we've simply trusted them to manage it responsibly. What Satoshi Nakamoto did was propose an entirely new story. A story where the main character wasn't some powerful institution staffed by fallible humans, but rather a piece of elegant, verifiable mathematics. A story based not on trust in people, who can be corrupted, make mistakes, or act in their own interests, but on trust in open-source code that's completely transparent and verifiable by literally anyone with a computer. This book is really a detailed chronicle of the very first people who dared to actually believe in that radically new story. And wow, what an incredibly diverse cast of characters they turned out to be. You have quiet, thoughtful idealists like Hal Finney, passionate, tireless evangelists like Roger Ver, brilliant but deeply flawed builders like Mark Karpelès, ambitious dreamers who crossed serious legal lines like Ross Ulbricht. Each of them saw in Bitcoin a direct reflection of their own personal hopes for how the world should work. For some, it was primarily a powerful tool for privacy and freedom from an increasingly overreaching government. For others, like Wences Casares, who'd lived through currency collapses, it was a genuine lifeboat for people trapped in countries with fundamentally broken financial systems. And for many others, let's be completely honest here, it was simply a thrilling, once-in-a-generation opportunity to get spectacularly rich. The book beautifully illustrates this tension that exists in basically every great technological revolution throughout history, the ongoing battle between the idealistic purists and the practical pragmatists. The early cypherpunks genuinely dreamed of creating a world completely without banks or government regulators interfering. But the painful story of Mt. Gox and the other failed, hacked, or fraudulent exchanges clearly shows us that maybe we actually do need some of those traditional intermediaries after all. Maybe most of us don't really want the burden and risk of being our own bank. Maybe we're actually willing to trade away some theoretical decentralization in exchange for real convenience, customer service, and security. The most powerful and practical takeaway for you, especially if you're someone just starting to build your life and career in this rapidly changing world, isn't really about whether you should rush out and buy Bitcoin as an investment. It's much more about truly understanding the fundamental power of a genuinely decentralized idea and what that means for the future. Think about it for a moment. Before the internet came along, information itself was highly centralized. It came from just a handful of major newspapers, a few TV networks, and established publishers. The internet fundamentally decentralized information, suddenly giving a real voice and platform to literally anyone with a keyboard and an internet connection. Bitcoin and blockchain technology represent the exact same potential paradigm shift, but this time for value and transactions. It's a technology that theoretically allows people to coordinate and transact directly with each other peer-to-peer, without necessarily needing a powerful middleman to facilitate, verify, and take their cut of every transaction. So what can you actually do with this understanding today, right now? Here are a couple of simple, concrete actions you can take. First, just start noticing the middlemen that exist throughout your own daily life. When you buy your morning coffee, when you send money to a friend, when you post a photo on social media, who are the specific companies and institutions that are quietly facilitating that action behind the scenes? What exact role do they play in the process? What value do they genuinely add? And what power and control do they hold over you as a result? Just developing that basic awareness and asking those questions is actually a powerful and important first step toward understanding how these systems work. Second, get genuinely curious about the core underlying idea of blockchain technology itself, separate from all the hype and price speculation. Don't obsess over the minute-to-minute price of Bitcoin or which cryptocurrency might make you rich. Instead, invest a little time in actually learning about how a decentralized, distributed ledger fundamentally works at a technical level. This is honestly a fundamental building block for the next generation of how the internet will function. Understanding it now, even at a basic level, is a lot like understanding how a web browser or email worked back in 1995. It gives you a valuable lens and framework through which to interpret and understand the future as it unfolds. Ultimately, digital gold is so much more than just the story of a weird new kind of money that might make some people rich. At its heart, it's really a story about the very human, timeless desire to build a better, fairer, more open world, where power isn't quite so concentrated. It's a powerful reminder that the systems we all live within, financial, social, political, are absolutely not set in stone or inevitable. They were invented and built by people in the past, which means they can be reinvented and rebuilt by people today and in the future. The journey of Bitcoin has been messy, chaotic, sometimes ugly, and definitely not what anyone expected. But it clearly demonstrates that a single powerful idea, unleashed at exactly the right historical moment, really can challenge even the most entrenched and powerful institutions on Earth, and, in the process, genuinely start to change the world. That was the complete book summary of Digital Gold by Nathaniel Popper. Look, we've covered the incredible journey from that mysterious white paper on Halloween 2008 to a multi-billion-dollar global industry. But I'll be completely honest with you. A summary like this can only take you so far. The real magic, the real insight, happens when you actually sit down and read the full book yourself. It's in those detailed stories and anecdotes, the complex personalities that practically leap off the page, and the genuine feeling of being right there as history unfolds in real time. This summary is really designed to give you a useful map of this fascinating new territory. But if anything we've talked about today has genuinely sparked your curiosity about the future of money, technology, and power, I really do encourage you to grab a copy of the actual book. Reading it for yourself isn't just passively learning facts. It's an experience that will genuinely change how you see and understand the systems that quietly run our world. Also, if you found this summary genuinely valuable and feel like it gave you a new, useful perspective on these ideas, please consider hitting that like button and subscribing to the channel. It really does help us understand we're on the right track with this content, and it makes sure you won't miss our next journey into another potentially life-changing book. Let's keep learning and growing together.